a very simple thing. I mean, if you don't understand where your interlocutor, your partner, your colleague is coming from, your opponent, your competitor in business is coming from, right? You're not going to do a very good job of either cooperating with them or competing with them.
All right, welcome back to Mind Matters, everyone. I'm Harrison Cayley with my co-host Elon Martin. Today, we are pleased to be joined by Gordon M. Hahn. Gordon is a geopolitical analyst. I'll get him to give a bit of his history, but before I do, I'll list his books, because that's primarily how I know him, his books and his blog. So we spoke with Gordon, I think it was around 5 years ago now, right prior to the release of his previous book, Ukraine Over the Edge. At the time, we were interviewing you, Gordon, about your work on the two books that you'd written on Russia's Islamist threat, so the book by that name and the Caucasus Emirate Mujahideen. And you've written one other book prior to that on Russia's revolution from above, on an analysis of the Gorbachev or late Gorbachev and all the Yeltsin years, so everything that was going on in the 90s and what that actually was. And your latest book is The Russian Dilemma: Security, Vigilance, and Relations with the West from Ivan III to Putin. This one just came out, was it in the last few months, Gordon? Or late last year?
November, I think it was.
Okay, yeah, late last year. I just got it recently, but it's a timely book. So I think that as you write in the preface, or I believe it's the preface or the introduction. Well, I won't quote from it, but basically the implication is a lot of analysts, not only analysts, but the general public and politicians in the West don't understand Russia, and it seems like they don't want to either. And this is kind of a new foray for you. This is kind of like deep history. You were focused mostly on like contemporary history. So first, I want to just ask you, what was the inspiration from this book, and how did you get into kind of a history that goes back through, well, pretty much all of Russian history, but focusing mostly on the last like 500 years?
Right. Well, basically, ever since the NATO expansion essentially began, I had sort of a intuitive sense that, and you can talk to really, it's actually not much rocket or political science. If you talk, basically, I'm trying to get at the book. Idea of the book is to get at the way Russians view their history and culture and their place in the world, right? So that we can understand their point of view, so we can understand how they might react when we take certain actions. That's essentially the idea. And if you talk to almost all Russians that I have spoken to, they express a sort of historical, shall we say, sense of suspicion, minimally speaking, of the West, sense of gripe about the West. And this pattern occasionally throughout Russian history gets broken, and there are periods, you might call it periods of confusion, or periods when the old model has been discredited, so they're turning to something else. And what I'm calling is a security vigilance culture, right? It's a culture that's very concerned about their national security. And most of that concern is focused on the West for historical reasons that I cover in the book. And so you really can't, if you don't understand the vigilance norm in Russian security culture and political culture, then you simply cannot predict accurately how the Russians are going to react to things like NATO expansion, to lectures about democracy, promises of economic assistance, and then much economic assistance doesn't come, like as in the early 90s. These sorts of things. And so, and that's true really in any relationship, right? If you don't understand where the other, it's a very simple thing. I mean, if you don't understand where your interlocutor, your partner, your colleague is coming from, your opponent, your competitor in business is coming from, right? You're not going to do a very good job of either cooperating with them or competing with them, right?
Yeah.
It's just not going to work. And that's going to lead to a breakdown and of the relationship. And in this case, we're talking about two, basically the United States and Russia, or NATO and Russia. You're talking about a great power, and then a declining superpower with a huge alliance, which basically makes it still a superpower. You're talking about a serious problem when there's confrontation in the relationship. So that's basically the genesis of the book. I talk about it in different terms, and I discuss what I mean by security culture and vigilance norm, but that's the sort of a simple way to try to explain what I was trying to get at. And I also was trying to get at what are the things that provoke change in the attitude towards the West over time.
Well, I'm just going to focus in on just one tiny thing you said there, because I was listening to, I've been watching interviews lately with what's going on, and just one comment that Scott Ritter made was that, in the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, in the State Department, in the foreign policy crowd in Washington, that it seems like the U.S. got rid of most of their actual Russia experts. So these were the guys that actually knew what was going on. They were experts in Russian history and culture, and just, they could speak fluent Russian, and they were experts. And it seems like they just got, they all just got let go, and it's like, okay, we don't need you anymore. And for the last 20 plus years, it's been, the way he puts it is that every Russia expert has pretty much gotten either their PhD or their credentials by writing a book on how evil Putin is, and that's kind of the extent of the. Yeah. He might be slightly exaggerating, but that seems like the extent of what's going on. So it's like there's a complete ignorance of what you call and the Russian security culture, and which this book gets into. Well, do you have any comment on that? On Scott Ritter's take?
I think that I agree with the fact that the problem is that these are people are not, they know certain things about Russia, but they don't really know the political culture. They have sort of a caricature image of what the political culture is, and strategic culture they're not particularly interested in unless it has to do with the military conflict, this sort of thing. A big problem was that at the time the Soviet Union collapsed, there was within the field, it was sort of a reflection of the general American hubris within academia. And that was the idea, and the idea of Fukuyama, end of history and so forth, this idea of transitology, that the whole world was basically transitioning from authoritarian rule to democratic rule and free markets, and that this was the inevitable and imminent outcome of world history. And so Russia was basically plugged into that model. And when it didn't work out that way, because we basically, in my view, the main cause is the expansion of NATO, though there are other causes, and the way that expansion of NATO interacts with the security vigilance culture that I'm trying to explain in the book, that led to a backlash. So that's essentially what the first problem was, this sort of hubristic methodology in political science. And that led to downplaying those who knew Russian culture well. Mm-hmm. By culture, I don't mean necessarily the arts, though the arts reflect sort of political values and political beliefs and aspirations and so forth. But I mean precisely those sorts of things, political aspirations and so forth, the fear, excuse me, attitudes, beliefs, aspirations, essentially. And so that led to a new kind of Russia specialist who was, he was sort of highly technical in terms of political science methodologies and this sort of thing, but having a kind of deep understanding of Russian culture and its implications quickly declined within the field. So you take a look. You look at a classic like James Billington's The Icon and the Axe. And these sorts of things that really give you a good orientation. Whether you agree with everything in the book is not really important, but it gives you a good orientation, a good starting point for trying to understand where Russians come from, literally speaking and figuratively speaking. So this is, very important because, again, you have to understand who you're dealing with, right? And Americans, we put someone into a certain box. If they don't fit into that box, then it's their fault and they're guilty and they're not sufficiently democratic and so forth and so on. And when I say that, I'm not saying Putin is clearly moving, in a more authoritarian direction. In his first few years, he was a sort of soft authoritarian leader. In his very first years, I think he was hedging his bets as to where he wanted to go, whether he wanted to continue with democracy or start moving in a more authoritarian direction. And events on the eve of his coming to power in Serbia and continuing NATO expansion after he came to power, and the rejection sort of or the lack of the lack of bearing of any fruit from his assistance, his full-throated support for the United States after 9/11, and then assistance in that regard only got met with more NATO expansion. And so these sorts of things, Russians have one part of the political culture. I mentioned this briefly in the book. It's really been written about very well by Andrei Tsigankov. The idea is Russians have a very deep, sensitive, deep-rooted and sensitive sense of honor, right? If they feel they're being dealt with respect and so forth, they can be worked with and deals can be made. If they feel they're being betrayed, they're being lied to, they're being conned, that's going to backfire in a very drastic way. And we're also seeing that now with and going back again to the promise not to expand NATO 1 inch behind Germany, and now we're fighting over NATO in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. So, the result is now the war, and this is a predictable outcome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I only had a chance to read a few chapters in your book, Gordon. A couple of them that really struck me, and I think provides a prelude to most of the body of your new book, was this idea that inside of the kind of socio-political, cultural DNA of Russians and Russian leadership is this extreme distrust born out of attacks and subversion and lessons learned. And the way you broke this down was very interesting. You kind of set up this delineated a cycle that Russia seems to have gone through, where it's liberal and open, gets attacked, and then reverts back to more traditional Russian values. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about how you've noticed that pattern emerging over history a little bit.
Well, just doing a close reading of history. When people talk about the zigs and zags of Russian history, they're usually referring to, the shift between a more authoritarian regime and a liberalizing regime. But in fact, this occurs in relations with the West as well. And so, we've this pattern, is virtually, it's undeniable, right? Usually it begins with a period in which, as a status quo, it may be it's typically a typical traditional authoritarian to one extent or another, a Russian form of rule. And this is not unusual throughout most of the world. Even today, most regimes are authoritarian, and we have good relations with lots of regimes that are authoritarian. And they begin to take in certain Western influences. Those Western influences then lead to a liberalization. The liberalization proceeds, and then something happens in the West that eventually leads either directly because someone in the West is targeting Russia, for example, the time of troubles, or the smuta, as they called it in Russian, right, when the Poles basically, with the Vatican's full-throated support, organized a military incursion, invasion, really, a sort of first case hybrid regime in which they used basically a proxy force and propaganda and all several different ways of trying to undermine the regime. Now, granted, this is connected to another key point, is that and this is connected to domestic politics, is that the opening for the Poles in doing this was that there was a split inside Russia, in which there was infighting inside the court, and the Tsarevich of Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible, was killed. And all of a sudden, in Poland appears this guy who claims that he is actually he is Dmitry, the Tsarevich, that he wasn't killed, that he survived. And then so the Poles decide that they're going to use this as a way, because he potentially has legitimacy to rule in Russia, right? If he is the Tsarevich, to expand Catholicism into Orthodox territory. So they put him at the head of this military force, and they move in from Poland through, incidentally, Ukraine, and they move up Ukraine up from the south, and eventually takes power in Moscow. Quickly, the Muscovites get tired of him because they don't like all these foreigners and all these Catholics and all these Jesuits walking around Moscow. And there are incidences with the wedding involving the daughter of the person who organized this force with Dmitry. And this was another step towards the Catholicization. Dmitry had the false Dmitry, apparently false. There's a debate in Russian history and whether he was actually the Tsarevich or not. I didn't really want to get too bogged down into that dispute because it's very complicated and has a long history, and I can't really make up my mind. My sense is that he was a false Dmitry, but who knows? And so this raises the issue of unity inside Russia, right? When there's division inside Russia, foreigners can use that division, right, to further destabilize the situation, make incursions, make military invasions, right? And so from this point on, you really begin to, there's this linkage between domestic unity and security vis-a-vis the West. Mm-hmm. And that cycle then continues. We see, after the Smuta, there's a period of reestablishing the old regime as best they can. Again, we see more Western influences coming in the late 17th century. Those progress in the early 18th century, leading to Peter the Great. Peter the Great goes into a massive Westernization program. And the result is, a century later, Napoleon's invasion, right? Throughout the 18th century is the period of the Russian Enlightenment, which is the aftermath of Peter's initial massive reforms, which then deepen and expand throughout Russia for the next century. And then the outcome is that the West has moved on to a new form of what constitutes liberalization. And it's actually not liberalization in the long term. It turns out to be Napoleon and a dictator. And he invades Russia. This leads to a backlash under Nicholas I, right? And because after they kick Napoleon out and they march him back to Paris, and the Russians occupy Paris for a while, then they withdraw. They create the Vienna Congress of Victors and the Holy Alliance to secure stability in Europe and to prevent any reemergence of Napoleonic revolutionism and republicanism, in quotes, republicanism, given that Napoleon was actually a dictator. And part of the officer corps that had been in the West became inspired by what they had seen in France, and they organized the Decembrist Revolt. And we're talking now 1825, after the defeat of Napoleon. There are various reasons why the revolt occurred, not just the fact that these officers had been in the West. The members of the aristocracy were tired of serfdom and various other factors. And the Decembrists, these officers, so the members of the cream of the elite officer corps in St. Petersburg, undertake a revolt. They had been planning and organizing a sort of democratic Republican movement for about 10 years or so. And then there was a question when Alexander I died, Alexander I being the one who led the Russian army to defeat, and other European armies to defeat Napoleon, died under sometimes considered mysterious circumstances when he traveled to the south died. There are rumors that exist to this day that he actually didn't die, that he actually didn't want to be the Tsar anymore and went to Siberia and became a starets and wandered the forests. And there's some. This is not. There are some basis. This is not some crazy Russian fantasy. There's some basis, in fact, for why this could have occurred. Because when Napoleon was first Alexander I was first being groomed to become the Tsar, he told his European teachers that he did not want to be the Tsar. And as soon as he could, he would take the chance and move to Europe and find some nice quiet corner in Europe to retire. And then when he attempted to institute a constitution, right, liberal westernized reforms, and then Napoleon invades, right? Those who are supporting the reforms now get to be blamed that they're allies of Napoleon. Then the Decembrist Revolt, 1825, officer corps, the officer corps, members of it want to establish a democratic regime. Alexander is dead. There's confusion as to there's a long, I go into it in a little bit of detail in the book. There's a long, complicated struggle and indecision about who should be the successor once the news comes to St. Petersburg that Alexander I has died. And because of that uncertainty in that period of about 10 days, 2 weeks, these officers decide to make a move, also because they're beginning to be found out by the secret police. So they decide to lead their respective units onto the central square in St. Petersburg and declare a constitutional government. And there's a conflict between the Tsar, and Nicholas I crushes the troops, and then that leads to a period of strong conservatism, under the so-called official nationality, under sort of an official ideology based on orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. By nationality meaning national tradition, not ethnicity, not Russian ethnicity. It's not some kind of a racist idea. It's the idea of Russian national tradition, somewhat similar to what Putin's talking about today as a counterbalance. Russia becoming a sort of counterbalance to the liberalism in the United States that's become sort of a crazy version of cultural Marxism. So this is another period of reversion back to the old tradition after a Russian invasion. And then we have, we can go into the Lenin, the German World War I, the revolution, the Germans funding Lenin, Lenin making a revolution. Doesn't really turn out very well for Russia, that revolution. Right. And then that leads us, to World War II and Hitler and so forth and so on. And so when the Cold War ends, by then there's a long record of Western invasions. We have this idea that there's when we discuss these things about, Russia becoming part of the West and so forth and so on. And, I support that idea. I would like to see Russia become part of the West because it would reduce the potential for conflict on the Eurasian landmass and the historical conflict between the West and Russia. But usually in our minds, when we say that, and I do this too sometimes, and then I, and then I catch myself, or later I start reading my own book, and I remember, that this Western thing isn't as much as it's cracked up to be, and that's especially true for Russians, right? The West produced Hitler. The Russians didn't produce Hitler. The West produced Marxism and communism. Russia didn't produce Marxism and communism. The West produced the kind of sort of first nationalist experience under Napoleon that Napoleon called republicanism and democracy and equality and brotherhood. So why wouldn't Russians look at that and say, wait a second, this is not necessarily all it's cracked up to be, when they come to us and they start saying, do what we say, be like us, and then everything is going to be fine. There's they're in the back of their minds, there is this history. And Russians know their history very well. They love history. They're very much the opposite of in this way to Americans who don't know their history, are not interested in history. We're always looking to the future and we're concentrating on the present. They're looking at the past and interpreting the present through the past. And they know their history. Now, not all Russians, of course, many Russians have a distorted view. They exaggerate. They have a paranoid view sometimes. precisely because of this history. Many have become paranoid. They exaggerated. The West is out to get Russia and so forth and so on. The West is always out. The West in toto is out to get Russia. And overlooking that there were conflicts inside the West, and usually it was one side that would end up causing a problem for Russia, not the entire West. And the same party that was causing a problem for Russia was causing a problem for the others, for elements in the West. So it's a complicated thing, and it's very easy to it's very easy for demagogues in the West and in Russia to simplify all this and use it to create paranoia and resentment far more than there should be, rather than having an intelligent discussion about how history is complicated. Yes, we've made mistakes. The Russians sometimes, quite often, overreact, which I believe we're seeing now ever since 2014. And this is the result. Now we have this mess.
Well, one of the concepts that you get into in the introduction, I believe, is this idea of cultural strains and what you can call like recessive cultural strains, and then the phrase. There's this sedimentization process and then this reactivation process. So what you see is some cultural strains will gain dominance in one period and kind of go dormant, and then conditions will change and then they'll be reactivated. And it can go both ways, right? So these can be the Western strains or the anti-Western strains or the Russian strains. But Russia's in this interesting position in that as you say, and you're not the only one, you quote others, is that Russia, a large part of Russia's identity and self-identification is based on the West. It is in relation to the West, either with the West as the anti-other or as the bad other, or the West as the source of its traditions, because you mentioned all those bad things that came from the West, like Hitler, like Marxism, etc. But what else came from the West? Well, Orthodoxy came from the West, the Christian tradition, and so there's this tension within the Russian psyche about creating a Russian identity that you have to admit is in some ways fundamentally borrowed from the West, but on the other hand, there's the hard line that has to be drawn to say no, this is Russia, and then there's the anti-Western sentiment that comes and goes, and as you write, for good reason. So, and a couple other elements that contribute to this situation. There's a few short comments that you have in the first chapter on so-called classic Russian autocracy and Russian imperialism, and a few times you make the comment that it's not so cut and dried, and it's often exaggerated in the West, this idea of Russian imperialism and Russian autocracy, and that actually in a lot of cases those concepts were borrowed from the West. I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit.
Right. Well, Peter the Great's idea of creating an empire was entirely borrowed, and even the symbols of imperial Russia were borrowed from the idea of Rome, not so much as Rome as not in the religious sense of the idea, which is also relevant here, is the idea of the third Rome. Once after Rome and Constantinople fell, Moscow became the third Rome, but that's often weaponized by people in the West to say, well, you see, that's the idea that the Russians are going to rule the world, that they're the new Romes and they're going to rule the world. That was purely a religious idea when it first came into view in the 16th century. It initially was, it became a more politicized idea in the 19th century, transformed by the Slavophiles. But the idea of a sort of imperial state didn't necessarily mean, certainly didn't mean any expansion into Europe, right? But what it did mean is that Russia would now be a player in that big European great game, right? Well, we would do what those Europeans do, right? We would seek to build our empire. Russians went east right, into Siberia and to the Far East, the way European powers went to the South and went to the West, into the Americas, and so forth and so on. Nothing unique here, and that was borrowed from the West. So if you look at where the the only time you can really, excuse me, talk about, except for the case of Poland, the only time you can really talk about basically Poland is the only example I can really think of a case where, after Peter the Great, there was an attempt by the Russians to seize territory that you could call European, right? And at the same time, they gave the Poles a certain amount of autonomy. Even Alexander I even gave the Poles their own constitution and let the Sejm continue to sit and so forth. Same thing here. Same thing in Finland. Finland had greater autonomy when it was part of the empire. But you don't see attempts by Russia to move in and seize Germany, to seize, say, the Czech lands, or to seize Romania, or to go, no less, to go to France. They go to France to defeat Napoleon. They leave. And with the other European powers, they set up a new system to make sure that a Napoleon episode doesn't repeat itself. So they're really behaving like other European powers. There's really, and if you look at the case of Napoleon in the aftermath, the Russians play a very, very positive role. That's really, in many ways, hard to find cases. Many cases, the other example would be when the United States defeats Japan and Germany and basically helps them get back on their feet. Of course, they're doing that similar to the Russians. The Russians were doing that to prevent the rise of a new Napoleon. We were doing that as a buffer against communism, right? It's nothing unusual about the way the Russians conducted themselves on the international stage. The only exception is under Soviet power. And of course, again, Lenin is the fruit of Marxism, and Marxism appeared in Europe, and that was the idea of creating a world communist system, right? And so for most of a good part of the Soviet period, there was this idea that, yes, we're going to spread communism. So by the 70s and certainly by the 70s, that the belief in that idea began to seriously wane, and Soviet Union became sort of a typical great power. Some aspirations, maybe if the opportunity arrives, right? We can certainly in certain places try to promote revolution, but the idea that some kind of imminent world revolution that would bring a communist world government that was seriously feasible, it's feasible at least in any kind of midterm, was sort of given up on. And therefore you have detente, and even under Khrushchev, you have peaceful coexistence, and he tries to expand revolution into the third world. But generally speaking, you don't see there. Sure, they funded parties, for example, in Europe and so forth and so on. So the dream sort of remained, but it didn't become the main driver, really, or the only driver, let's put it that way, of Soviet foreign policy. And that's really not, the Soviet case, the Soviet era is an aberration in Russian history, right? It was a complete overthrow of everything that had come before 1917 in Russia. So it doesn't really make for a good example of so-called some kind of inherent Russian imperialism that can't be shaken. That's any different from any Western imperialism. I don't see the difference between what we did in the West, here in the United States, and what the Russians did in their East, in Siberia and so forth.
Yeah.
Actually, it's something I've always wanted to do research and look at the consequences for the indigenous peoples and do a comparison and see which side was more brutal. There probably has been something written on that. I just haven't gone around to researching it, but it would be an interesting thing to look at. And so, even the idea of getting involved in, I already forgot which war it was, a major war in Europe. The Swedes suggested it to the Russians. The imperial powers were constantly trying to draw Russia into, when they were a second-tier power, draw Russian into their alliances when there were alliances battling each other in Europe, for example, before in the pre-Napoleon War era, and so on. So again, what here is particularly unique about Russian international behavior? I don't see it. Don't see it.
Well, what you just said about...
We hear about Russian... Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. No, I don't want to repeat myself. Yeah.
I was glad you just mentioned how Soviet Russia was a bit of an anomaly in the context of its history. I think that's a great point. And if anything, the Russians themselves were the hardest to suffer from it, and I dare say that it's still part of their cultural memory. And who they are now is in great part, I think, a response to how they experienced life under the Soviet regime. And bringing things a little more current, Gordon, you mentioned at the very top of the show, Putin's early on in his presidency reaching out to the U.S. in support after the tragedy of 9/11. And it was only a few years later that he also reached out, from what we know, to the Bush White House in an attempt to receive some assistance or help in dealing with terrorism coming out of Chechnya, I believe. And from what I understand, he was rebuffed, or rather they didn't even respond. And so to me, that is very early on in his particular history and experience of the U.S., a kind of experience that taught him something about how he can trust or not trust the West with very serious security issues that Russia was dealing with at the time.
Well, there was some cooperation. I don't know the particular episode that you're talking about. It's probably I just somehow missed it, but there was cooperation in terrorism after 9/11. However, Putin now has been saying it's not clear sometimes which period he's talking about, whether he's talking about before he was president, the first Chechen War, or the second Chechen War, and then the period of the North Caucasus jihadism and Caucasus Emirate and so forth. But he says that the American intelligence was actually helping the jihadists, and he's made that statement at least twice. The first time he said that was about. So it's even worse than what you're describing, if that's true. And as far as I know, no Bush never came out and said that that's a lie, that Putin was lying, that the U.S. intelligence was helping the Chechens. Bush never denied that, as far as I know. And even more recently, Putin said that, I think it was within the last few months, maybe even within a month, he made that point again. So. And I wouldn't doubt that in the least. Unfortunately, I wouldn't doubt that. Now, what kind of help they were getting and how the volume of assistance and so forth and so on, I don't think would have been greatly significant. We do know that, for example, that even during the first war, the same groups that were raising money for jihadists in Afghanistan and other places were also in the United States. There were front organizations tied to Saudi Arabia and other, the Muslim Brotherhood and so forth and so on, that were raising money in the United States for various jihadi movements, and that included for jihadis in Chechnya. And in fact, the so-called 20th, the 20th or 1920th, I believe, 9/11 bomber was training on how to fly. I believe it was in Minnesota. And the FBI got wind of him, and they had some suspicions, and they were going to detain him. And if they had, the whole plot would have been uncovered. And the reason that at least one report is that one of the reasons that they decided not to move against this guy was that his only connection to the global jihad was with Mr. Hattab, and Hattab was a close associate of Basayev, who was one of the leaders of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, which was half jihadi at that time and half radically extremist Chechen nationalists, and they decided that, well, there's really no connection between the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria and jihadism, so we won't check up on this guy. And of course, that was a gross mistake, because in fact there were many jihadis, including Hattab, who was very close. I wouldn't say very close, but he was close to Osama bin Laden. When he was killed, Osama bin Laden wrote an obituary for him. So, and we heard for years and years and years that the Chechens had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. And, well, I remember going to a conference and there was this guy, what was his name? Williams. He actually was a consultant for the CIA in Afghanistan. And his big thing was that he said, well, I traveled around Afghanistan and I never met, one Chechen, and everyone I spoke to said that there were no Chechens. There were other people who were saying other things, but he was saying that. And not surprisingly, people in DC gave him the front page and not others. And I remember him writing and then stating at a conference I was at that the Chechen, and this is already 2012, and he's saying that the Chechens are closer to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson than they are to Al-Qaeda. And I almost fell off my chair. And I said, I raised my hand and said to him, I look at those Chechen sites and the Caucasus Emirate sites every day, and Chechen is the Republic earlier, the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria's websites. And, I have not seen one video of a speech from George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, but I've seen loads of them by bin Laden and Maqdisi, who was a leading ideologist, jihadism at the time. They're all over the place. That's what the whole site consists of, videos of their own people or the global jihadists. It's a sad thing. It's really a sad thing to look at the way Washington handles these issues, because it's basically anything is put through the prism of being anti-Russian, basically. So the view that there was a jihad in Russia was played down because, well, maybe we can use this against the Russians, and the Russians anyway are brutal, and these people want freedom, so why should we turn against them? And then if you take the Putin's claim at face value that they were getting assistance from the United States, from the CIA, well, that makes even more clear why people like Williams were getting the front page and so forth. Hard to tell how well that's coordinated and all part of one effort, but certainly can't be excluded, right?
Well, and this is all part of this pattern that you talk about in the book, and the effect of which is that in Russian eyes, these Western institutions and methods are discredited. So, and there's this big irony involved, and you've already in your rundown of the chronology of how this applies in all this last hundreds of years of Russian history, you kind of show this or showed this today, that even when Russians are liberalizing and westernizing, then there will be a major Western intervention of some sort, and then Russia kind of rebuilds after a destruction like the time of troubles, and then looks back and just says, look at what the West said and what they gave us. It's like, why would we copy you guys? Why would we do this?
Right.
That essentially through the West's attempts to reform Russia, at the point of a bayonet or the barrel of a gun, then they're surprised when there's resistance, right?
Right, and this leads to the whole problem of the charges, of collusion, that people who are for democracy or for liberalism or for free markets in Russia are, and Putin just made another reference to the fifth column again about 2 weeks ago, that these people are members of Fifth Column and they're working for Western intelligence and so forth and so on. So it completely undermines those in Russia who actually do want to become a state that's that's liberal, but in the classical liberal sense, not what we call liberalism today, which is basically lost its mind. But and the other issue is that there begins to be this reaction towards even just Western influence, not just not suspicion of the persons themselves who carry the influence, but the actual influence itself, this idea, it's in the political science, ontological security, right? That our Russian identity and our Russian tradition is now being undermined again by those Westerners who brought us, Napoleon and the Decembrist revolt and the Smuta and Hitler and so forth and so on. And we should stick to our Russian traditions. And that means, no liberalism, no democracy. That democracy and liberalism, they're just fronts for military expansion and economic expansion and subjugation of Russia and so forth and so on. And they think that this is the extent of the way people think in Washington. And of course, it's an exaggeration. There are many people in Washington who indeed use the idea of democracy. And unfortunately, I think in the last 20 years, it's even become more so. They use democracy and so forth and these ideas of human rights, but the real goal is for economic expansion and NATO expansion and so forth and so on. I think that pattern has become worse over the last 20 years or so. But even back in the previous periods, there was a tendency to exaggerate this. And of course, if you're a very authoritarian leader, if you're someone like a Stalin, for example, then you can really ramp up the exaggeration and the lying if you need to, for whatever your domestic purposes may be. And so this becomes a very handy tool in the in the toolbox, in the playbook, as I like to say nowadays.
The Russian playbook.
Of the right, the Russian playbook of the authoritarian leader who wants to crack down, right? He can just go back to this old scenario and say we have to, go back to the dominant strains in our political culture, the traditional ones, and throw these recessive ones that always manage to cause us so much trouble every time they start to percolate up from the sediment and start to influence us again. So, and we see the same pattern in the post-Soviet period, right? Period of liberalization, perestroika. I remember being in Moscow in the late 80s and early 90s, and people just loved Americans. I mean, it was just everybody wanted to go and meet an American and associate with an American. God, how that has changed. What a difference now, 30 years later. And quite honestly, someone who likes to go to Russia, I don't even know if I want to go there again. I'm worried about my own security, quite honestly, because no reason why Russians aren't going to radicalize as you see what's going on in the West in terms of attitudes towards Russians. There's going to be a backlash in Russia, too. To how great that will be, hard to tell. Mm-hmm. So it's all very disconcerting, to say the least. And it's the old pattern is repeating. We're just in a new again, Simburgskian cycle is playing out, and we're back into the traditional phase. How and when there'll be a return to some kind of softening of relations, and then some kind of softening of the internal regime, and when, awfully hard to tell. But I can't see, unless this war goes very, very badly. And even then, the support for Democrat, there is no really indigenous now strong support for democratization and free markets. So it's going to take a decade or two of limited growth under a more authoritarian centralized economy and other problems that might be caused by Putin's overreaction that may lead to another reconsideration and liberalization and so forth, a defeat in the war and so forth. But even the defeat in the war at this point could lead to worse disaster, because someone much worse than Putin could actually come to power in reaction to some kind of defeat in this war. So there's no Democrat waiting in the wings with any support either within the regime or in society to come to power, and that includes Mr. Navalny, who is not particularly well. You look at his approval ratings are not very high. So
that's one. I wanted to mention Navalny.
Yeah.
I wanted to mention Navalny because
maybe that could change. Things went real bad.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, sorry. Go ahead.
So you brought up Navalny. I was going to bring him up because, again, I think that he's got good PR in the West, of course, and I think that a lot of Westerners get the impression that he's Well, if I could try to summarize the Western impression, it's that here's this this dissident freedom fighter fighting the system, good ordinary freedom wanting Russians support this guy, and if only it would just be the dream of a lot of Western Russian watchers if Navalny were to be able to take down the regime and become president. And but I think what a lot of people don't first of all, your book gives a context for how to understand Navalny and how to understand how Russians understand Navalny, because that's not the reality. Like you said, in Russia, actually, Navalny isn't very popular. He is popular among a small percentage of people, and a lot of a significant number, but still a small number of young liberal Russians. But when you look at actual, when you talk to Russians and when you look at Russian opinion polls, and he's not popular. And the book kind of explains why that is. And Navalny, it's almost like it's weird watching the last 10 years play out, because it's almost like someone read a version of your book before it was written, or was looking down on history and saw these patterns and said, how can we recreate everything totally according to type, and so that everything locks into place? Because, well, what does Navalny do? He has ties to the West. He flies to the West. He has obvious interactions to who knows what degree with Western intelligence agents. He is the epitome of the kind of trope or archetype of the Russian colluder that appears throughout history, like in your book. Like who was one of the first ones in the first cycle? Was it
Kurbsky,
I can't remember.
Under Ivan Grozny. Kurbsky, and of course, the false Dmitry essentially was a colluder, right? Kurbsky, who was Ivan Grozny's main opponent, and then Dmitry is in a sense a colluder, and then I designated Peter the Great as sort of a ontological colluder, in that he wanted to fully Westernized Russian culture and society, technology and so forth and so on. Not so much society, to a certain extent, society. And of course Tsarevich, Peter's son, who was supposed to succeed Peter, who went over to the side of the Austrians, right? So it's a whole history of colluders. The problem with Navalny is that, he, as you said, he completely openly. The best thing that any opposition leader who wants to create a democratic system would be to limit his ties to the West, and only propose things, propose the Western model in form,
Russian terms,
in content, but not in form, right? Minimize his traveling abroad to the West. I'm not saying not go at all, and not saying not mention the West at all, but minimize all those things and try to appeal to everyday Russian issues, and also look back on Russian history and try to explain, because there is an interpretation of history that in Russian history that's worth writing a book about, is that in fact the turn away from liberalism every time for Russia has actually been a disaster. It's led to very bad things. Unfortunately, one of the main causes of their turning away from Western models is the West itself. That's the deep irony. That's the Russian dilemma, right? And that's why you often hear Russians say, we want to borrow from the West, but we don't want to become like the West, right? And that's probably a good approach for any opposition leader who wants to really create a republican system, small r, in Russia, and some semblance of free market capitalism, and some kind of at least semi-federative system, though that's certainly not a prerequisite for America to have good relations with Russia. And that's another issue that I always like to bring up, is that the American assumption is, and claim is, and belief, and I tend to believe it myself, is that Republican systems and market systems are more efficient, and they're more just, and so forth and so on. If we're competing in the world, then it's hard to overstate the case. It's to our advantage that we would be the only Republican system and free market system in the world, right? Because we would have the most effective system. So what do I care if Russia has an effective system or not? I don't care. It's actually to my benefit that Russia doesn't have an effective system. So why alienate Russia, turn it into an enemy, right? In order to make them more effective. There's no logic to the strategy. It's an anti-strategy. It's shooting yourself in the foot. Rather than having an ineffective competitor, we made an enemy, right? Thank God that they don't have with the extent of anti-Western attitude now and anti-American attitude. Thank God they don't have a very effective system, because they'd be that much more powerful. Now, they certainly do have an effective system enough to cause us a hell of a lot of problems, right? But it's not, it's not China, right? And it's not the old United States or even the present day United States in decline. And Russia has, of course, enormous potential. If it hadn't been for the 1917 revolution, Russia would probably be, the 20th century would have been the Russian century, very, very likely. But it didn't turn out that way.
Well, I think, Gordon, part of the answer there is that the U.S. Has become so financialized. It's become so much of a monopoly capitalist military power, projecting this hyper aggressive force in all spheres, political and economic, all across the world. That the kind of honest competition that you would so identify in Russia correctly is like it's not only a threat from an honest competitive point of view, but it's also it's just got more character and more integrity in its transactions with the world, and so that too, in some ways, has to be suppressed and not allowed to exist. But I did have a question for you, kind of connected to Navalny, because like we have Navalny and Pussy Riot and all of these various Western exports to Russia that seek to kind of subvert its culture and its politics in some sense. And then you have guys, I forget what his name is, but he was he recently stepped down, and this was a long time.
Chubais?
Was it Chubais? Yes, he was the chairman of sustainability.
Who just left the country?
Yes, he just left.
Yeah, right, Anatoly Chubais. Yeah.
And so there seems to be, if not exactly a fifth column, but at least a strain of Atlanticists, pro-Western Russian politicians who don't see the dangers in the way that Putin and a great deal of his team see the dangers, I think. Do you have any comments about that contingent within the Russian government?
Yeah, they're a group of they call them the system liberals. People like Alexei Kudrin, Chubais formerly, although he was head of nanotechnology, it was a state company, but it wasn't a state body. And there are others at the head of Sberbank, the Russian savings bank, the largest bank outside of the central bank. German Graf and others. These people are sort of system liberals who have been, and even someone like Abramovich, who is an oligarch, but really doesn't hold any official post. He's sort of, I guess, a system liberal within the elite rather than within the state, and but connected to the state, obviously. And these people, basically, they're certainly economic liberals, and they support the idea of the free market and so forth and so on. And they would probably be more politically liberal than certainly Putin would be. but they simply have they have no political influence whatsoever within the system. They do have economic influence, and probably quite a bit. I think Putin really listens to definitely Kudrin. He listens to Kudrin without a doubt, and he probably listens to Nabibulin, the head of the central bank, and some other people. She's also a system liberal, so Putin's. I think has really grown as a person who understands economics and how to use the economy to defend Russian interests and so forth, and to protect the Russian economy from Western meddling, probably overdoing it, but for understandable reasons, given our behavior over the last 20 years. I wanted to come back to your point about our creating basically a one world financial system, which we basically control and so forth. And this is really the problem, is that ever since the Cold War, we've established a hegemony in so many different areas. And rather than trying to, classic manifestation of this was the famous, Nuland, Victoria Nuland, who was caught on a taped telephone call saying "F the EU," right? This is the classic, imperial hubris, right? And we've operated in a way for the last 20 years, maybe even 30 years since the end of the Cold War, seemed to have gained steam the farther we got from the end of the Cold War, and seems to be gaining steam to this day, of this sort of hubristic behavior on the world stage, which on the one hand discredits everything about republicanism and free markets by trying to create a hegemonic system in which we control everything. And now at the same time at home is crushing freedom of speech and so forth and so on, and yet goes abroad and claims it's defending republicanism and free markets. This is the height of hypocrisy, and it's going to destroy our reputation. To what extent reputation exists throughout the world, besides outside of Western Europe, what remains of our reputation will be completely destroyed. And you're seeing this already in the effort to impose sanctions in various countries not going along. For example, Brazil and South Africa and India. These are major countries. These aren't rinky-dink. This is not Austria, and this is not Luxembourg and Belgium. These are major economic powers, and they're not going along with the game. And part of it is because of this behavior over the last 20 or 30 years. And Russia's just made itself sort of the lightning rod. And given the Russian character and so forth, it doesn't surprise me. They would be the first ones that would just revolt. Russians are very sort of, even when they're even being very compliant, they're also internally, they're very kind of revolutionary. Gleb Pavlovsky, who's a Russian political scientist who in the early 90s was pro-perestroika and pro-Yeltsin. And then when Putin came to power, he joined Putin and he became very anti-liberal and anti-perestroika. Then he was removed from the Kremlin, and now he's very anti-Putin. No, he writes very interesting stuff and speaks very interesting stuff and has some really, really good insights. And he says that, Russians don't like to be part of the crowd. They just don't. That sounds counterintuitive, right? Because we think of Russians as, collectivists and so forth and so on. And I'm writing a new book about what I'm calling selflessness, which is wholeness, the idea the Russians seek wholeness. But in reality, in relation to certain circumstances, Russians don't really want to be part of the crowd. They have a strong sense of their own sovereignty and their own will to create their own life, right, and to defend their own traditions. And when they see a tradition that runs counter to that, and they see everyone following it, their natural inclination was to say, no, we don't want to be part of that. And when the people, the center of that that global tendency was at the same time damaging Russian national security interests by expanding NATO to Russia's borders and having violated a promise and violated the sense of Russian honor with a lie, you put it all together, it's a time bomb. It's all a big time bomb that's now exploding in Ukraine. And what's particularly disconcerting, I've probably gotten off too far into the contemporary issues, but what's particularly disconcerting is you see throughout this crisis, there's no give on either side, right? You see the West, for every escalation, first we're not going to buy oil and gas. Now the Russians are going to demand that the oil gas be paid for in rubles. all that seems to be actually having been somewhat overstated according to something I just read, but it needs to be checked. But you basically see a constant escalation at the supplying of weapons to the Ukrainians, the escalation in rhetoric on both sides, especially on the part of the West. This is extremely disconcerting because it's the type of thing, basically we pushed Putin to the point where he made what I consider to be a mistake of going into Ukraine in the way he did in a general way. Though that should be a caveat should be put on that, right? Because we don't really know right now what the original intent was on going in. One theory is that all the activity going on in the north around Kiev and Kharkov is a faking expedition, right? When the real thing is they want to expand in the southeast and they want to take Luhansk and Donetsk and maybe parts of Novorossiya. And by putting an invading force in the north, and they make sure that the Ukrainian army could not put all their eggs in one basket in the south. Countering that idea would be, well, they could have just loaded up troops on the border between Ukraine and Belarus if they wanted to achieve that, right? Maintain the threat there to the north without actually going in and having to, kill people, which escalates the situation. So I have criticism, just as I criticized Putin for annexing Crimea in 2014 because I thought it was too much of an escalation. I think he could have done something much more that would have been much more PR savvy and would have actually done a much better job of keeping people in the West on his side. And I think he could have limited his options here as well. There are a whole host of options he could have taken in the present situation to intensify the threat that he was posing to get people to talk without them moving in and starting a war, which means people get killed. He could have massed troops, increased the number of troops in Kaliningrad, could have massed troops in Crimea, could have massed troops and created a permanent base on the border with Ukraine in Donbass. All sorts of things he could have done to drive the message home. Without invading first. He could have held the option of invasion in his back pocket. The caveat to all that is, because I'm someone who likes to look at all the options. I don't believe that there are, these people who come to you and say, well, I have all the answers and this is precisely how it worked and this is what Putin was thinking and so forth and so on. I think he leaves his options open and there are still a lot of options on the table. And when he went into this, I'm sure he tried to keep some options open. The caveat to that is that, even if he takes, say, Donbass, or even over all of so-called Novorossiya, the entire southeast, and takes the entire Black Sea and Azov coast all the way up to Odessa and so forth, he's going to be faced with the same exact problem he had. He's going to have the Ukrainian army just over some kind of a contact line or a border or whatever. The situation in Ukraine is could very easily be gravely destabilized. We could see something, it may not get this bad. There may be something, a small scale version of what we saw in Iraq and Syria. The Zelensky regime melts down. There are different neo-fascist groups and oligarchic groups with their own armies, and fighting ensues, and you have various groups fighting in Ukraine amongst themselves. Since there's no central government, there may not be any central control over what these people do on the border with Novorossiya, Donbass, whatever you want to call it. And that could lead to same kind of, occasional sniping, sending artillery, mortar rounds, and killing civilians. And now Putin's again faced with the same dilemma. Only he's already pushed in farther. He's already alienated the West even more. And now he's still faced with the same darn dilemma, right? He's still got the Ukrainians over there sniping and firing away. Mm-hmm. And then we get the whole issue of the decision-making process, because there was a recent report, and of course, nowadays we have to be very suspicious of anything the U.S. intel tells us about their analysis. But there was a recent report published in which they said that according to their analysis and information, whatever that might be, Putin made his decision to invade very late. In other words, he wasn't planning all along when he was massing all those troops, which basically was my argument. I didn't think he was going to invade on any massive scale. I thought he would declare the independence of Donbass maybe if the I thought the negotiations would go on for some time, at least another month or two, and then maybe if there was no progress, he would say, "Okay, I'm going to annex Donbass." But that would leave him with the same problem I described with you before, right? In this case, they're saying that he made his decision at the last minute. And so if you look at, I was looking at the OSCE reports on the firing back and forth between the Ukrainian army and the neo-fascist dominated Nazi battalions on the one side and the DNR and the LNR, the Donbass forces on the other side. And on February 18th, there was a major escalation of firing from the Ukrainian side on Donbass. Forget the exact scale of but it was something like the amount of firing in one night equal to a month for several previous months.
Yep.
And shortly after that, Zelensky made his foolish statement about, well, maybe we should consider just abandoning the 1994 Budapest, which was code for we should think about acquiring nuclear weapons.
Nukes. Mm-hmm.
And then if you add the fact that there are nuclear materials in Ukraine, you have the potential of a dirty bomb. So you put all that together, and that may have been the casus belli that kind of finally Putin said, well, okay, that's enough. No one, these people do not want to negotiate. The West isn't making them negotiate. So we're going to just go in. That may have been the thing. Now they're claiming, the Russians, of course, are claiming that they have found evidence that the Donbass forces, the Ukrainian forces, were planning to invade today. They mentioned the date of February 28th. Earlier, the date was March 8th. Now that could be disinformation propaganda. They promised today that they were going to show documents. So if they show us documents, then we can make our decision whether that's true or not. But even without that, of course, they wouldn't have known that before. They found that out after they invaded and got their hands on documents, supposedly. But even with that, given 8 years of no progress on Minsk, and there was also a statement in that period that I described, February 18th, and of a high-ranking official of Ukraine, I forget which one it was. There's no way we're ever going to fulfill Minsk. So basically, threw Minsk in the garbage. So that meant negotiating from scratch in a period when Putin was trying to accomplish quite the opposite. He was trying to get these guys to begin to fulfill Minsk, and instead they're throwing it in the garbage. They're increasing the violence along the contact line, and Zelensky's talking about getting nuclear weapons.
Doing
so
the opposite.
This also, it's either I might add to my suspicion. I haven't studied it closely. I have an inkling, a nagging suspicion that the Ukrainians are very much like the Russians, right? They're stubborn too. They have their own sense of honor. And you got two peoples now who are facing each other who are just not going to give in. That's what really concerns me. But these guys, just like the Russians, they're not going to back down. And you have two sides that are ready to go to the death to win. Right. And this is extremely, if that's an accurate analysis, we're in a very dangerous situation because at the same time, you have, nuclear powers and a potential nuclear confrontation standing over this, these basically proxy forces. Right. So it's a very, very, very dangerous situation, I think, all in all. And deeply concerned. I don't see, the other problem is I don't see a way out. Maybe you want to give a question. I'm going on too long. The other thing is I don't see a way out for Putin going back to what I said before about, extending the line. Every time he extends the line forward, he still may be faced with firing coming from the other side, depending on the ability of Zelensky to control his forces on the other side, assuming Zelensky's still alive, which, there are many people in the Nazi battalions who would like to kill him. Or the Russians could kill him intentionally or accidentally. And then you have chaos. So it's a very, this situation is so explosive. We are so close to the end that it's, we really, and this disturbs me that you don't see any effort as far as there's no public evidence of it. Maybe there's behind the scenes effort of Washington making any attempt to sort of nudge the Ukrainians in the direction of making more compromises and trying to maintain contact with Putin to talk to him. I think that would change. I think that would really, maybe it won't change anything anymore. Maybe it's too late for that.
Yeah.
But if after the invasion occurred, immediately after the invasion occurred, we had tried to keep our lines open to both sides and tried to encourage a ceasefire rather than saying, well, no, we're just going to arm the Ukrainians and cut off all ties with the Russians. What an escalation.
But you know what, Gordon, the lines have been open for a very long time. The problem is there has never been any credible action from Washington in response.
Breakdown in trust, right? I was reading, I wanted to bring this up. Or did you have a point that you wanted to make in addition to that? Okay. Yeah. I mentioned this on a previous show, but I recently read a new book on, totally off topic, a new kind of, well, it's not a biography, but it's a new book on Julius Caesar called Julius Caesar and the Roman People. And it's by Robert Morstein Marx. And part of the book, well, one chapter is about the Civil War. And he's got an appendix on there with his kind of game theory analysis of the relations between Pompey and Caesar and exactly how they broke down. And he busts a lot of myths in the book on what actually happened. But what he basically argues is that the kind of classic game theory kind of prisoner's dilemma, iterated games kind of method of looking at this was that it's a good explanation for what happened between Caesar and Pompey, where trust was degraded on both sides to the extent that each side saw conflict as inevitable. Now, it turns out that Caesar actually held open the possibility for peace a lot longer than most people actually think when they're looking at history. So it broke down. It wasn't crossing the Rubicon that was actually the time to go to war. After that, there were still negotiations and still like entreaties to and embassies to make peace and to avoid a war. But the overall message was that it was this complete breakdown in trust. That both sides eventually saw that, well, no, I can't do this because I can't trust that they will be able to make an agreement. And how have the Russians been seeing Americans for the last 10, 15 years? Well, I think it was Lavrov who he used a Russian phrase for it, or a Russian word, not agreement capable. That, you say one thing, you do another. We talk to one person, or we talk to the executive branch, they say one thing, and then the CIA does another thing, the military does another thing. You're not all on the same page. We can't trust you. So there's this when the levels of trust have broken down so completely, then it's almost, well, it's like war is the continuation of politics by other means, or whatever. Was that Clausewitz? I don't know, but. It's like when international relations break down like that, it's like the base state that they revert to is warfare. And it's like, people should be, you'd think that politicians should be aware of this and wanting to avoid it. But, not every leader, not every politician wants to avoid war. I mean, they might, but not necessarily. I mean, it's not like we're living in a world without war and that this is some aberration. I mean, there are reasons for why wars happen, and in hindsight, they're always preventable, or at least, we can look back and say, oh, this should have been done. This should have been done.
Right.
And we should, to learn the lesson for it. But it's just frustrating that effort isn't put in the present, and from any present hasn't been put in the past years to make it not, if not an inevitability, then a very high probability.
Yeah. It's basically the American hubris sort of drove us into this position. And now at the same time, we see a degradation of the American system itself. You're seeing less discipline within the system, that rogue intelligence services, the military is entirely politicized. It's not clear what kind of control Biden is capable of executing over various institutions. All this is also deeply disconcerting, and this is probably what Lavrov is confronting when he's meeting with all these different entities. And there doesn't seem to be any adult in the room in Washington, D.C. to say, okay, the Russians overreacted. They overreacted in Crimea, but we've done some pretty provocative stuff too. And, yeah, we'd like to expand NATO to the borders, and then we could sell weapons to all those countries and so forth and so on, and expand our businesses to all those countries and keep the Russians basically out. And yeah, that would be all to our advantage. But the problem is we're risking a nuclear war trying to achieve this. And is it really worthwhile? Maybe we ought to just pull back and wait, maybe figure out a different way to accomplish all these goals, right? Rather than just upping the ante constantly. Basically, the United States was not involved at all in the Minsk process at all for this whole 8 to 7 year period. After the first Minsk agreement, there was no effort. And now Biden's advice to Zelensky is, yeah, it's up to you if you want to give up territory for peace. We're not going to make any suggestions and so forth and so on. And it just seems like not to mention the biggest how do you call it? Negligence, or it's worse than negligence. It's really, again, probably a function of the hubris, is the whole strategy of NATO expansion and Ukraine, right? Based on our assumptions about Putin. The line is that Putin is aggressive. He either wants to recreate the Soviet Union. He certainly wants to take Ukraine. He's aggressive and he's unstable and he's a bully and he's a street thug and so forth and so on. At the same time, we promote a policy that Putin despises, because of the history that we have in the post-Cold War era, the promise and so forth and so on. And we promise that Ukraine and Georgia someday are going to be members of NATO. But while this nasty Putin is sitting there over the border, and we're doing these things, getting nasty Putin angry by saying Ukraine's going to be in NATO. And then after the events of 2014, and in recent years, we begin sending weapons into Ukraine. The Brits are building 2 bases in Ukraine. Basically, NATO, as Putin made the point, Ukraine's becoming a member of NATO without becoming a member of NATO. All this is going on in front of a guy who you say is just dying to punch somebody in the nose, right? And it's like you're walking up to a bully. Everyone tells you, if you go up to that guy and you stare into his eyes, you're gonna get punched in his face. And you go up to him and you stare in his eyes and you get punched in the face. Okay. Now who's guilty? Of course, he's guilty because that's his character, right? On the other hand, you're guilty for going up there and challenging him, right? Maybe you didn't need to do that. Maybe you should have let somebody else or 4 guys 2 weeks from now gang up on him and beat him up, and maybe he'll learn his lesson, right? Down the road. You didn't need to sort of confront him in his wheelhouse. And at the same time, we're doing all this. We're saying no, but Ukraine's going to enter NATO, Putin. Too bad you don't like it, but not now. Maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years. So Vladimir Vladimirovich, you have 5-10 year window in which you can resolve this problem any way you choose. And we have previous experience of what happened in Georgia, right? So where's the surprise? Why are we surprised? There is no reason whatsoever to be surprised about this. I was surprised about the timing. I didn't think he would do it now, but I was sure that if things continued to go in the direction they did, it would happen sooner or later, because we created a situation in which it became logical for Putin to do what he did.
Gordon, I want to ask your response to something that, like, a counterpoint that I've heard and seen in various ways. I was watching a stream the other day where it came up. What would you respond to the people? Well, before I get to that, I want to mention an article that you put up. It was a pretty short one on, I can't remember the title of it, but it was basically on Russian security culture and NATO, NATO as an actual, how to understand perceiving NATO as an actual threat. And you brought up the point that, that even assuming, and it is true, that NATO is this totally benign, security structure, that doesn't factor into to a nation's security analysis and what goes into their planning and their look at their view of the situation, because that you don't look at the situation necessarily as it is. You look at it as it is, but you have to take into account all potentialities. So you have to take into account NATO as the way it is, NATO as it could be, and what could happen with just some changes of heads of state. Because as you mentioned, countries change, governments change, and if you say, oh well, this country's really nice right now, we don't have a good relationship with them, but we don't have any problems with them, so I'm just going to leave it alone and not consider it. And then next year the country gets taken over, it descends into some kind of like authoritarian nightmare, and all of a sudden they are now your enemy. Oh, it's like, oh well, and you don't want, like, it doesn't make any sense politically, geopolitically, militarily to just leave yourself open to that possibility. So in that sense, that's I think that was a good explanation, just really briefly, that you wrote on kind of just geopolitics and how nations in general look at their security. It's like you have to take into account potentialities as well. And so, like with the 5 to 10 years thing, okay, well, you're not NATO now. Well, you've stated you will be in 5 to 10 years, or that you could be. Well, what if you are? What if things change in the meantime? We have to take into account, from Russia's perspective, we have to take into account those potentialities. Now, one of the things that well, I'll ask you to respond to that if you have anything else to say about that. But also, I've heard this a lot coming from what I'd consider kind of the young generation of political commentators that like kind of more alternative, not necessarily like big news channels or anything like that, but just guys on the internet, kind of like, well, I won't name anyone, but, and this is the kind of the kind of very like patriotic, pro-American, but anti-government kind of at the same time, and they're saying, oh well. This was totally evil, just because Ukraine is a sovereign country. They have the right to choose if they want to be in NATO, and that was kind of like end of discussion. It kind of goes in that directions. But I wanted to know if you had any. I mean, yeah, I'll give my short response. Yeah, sure, but things are more complicated than that. What would you say to something like that?
Well. To the first question that you raised, there a couple of things. One is, first of all, countries don't make their military strategy, their defense posture, their defense and security intelligence budgets based on the intentions of other countries. So if you assume, that democratic regimes are more benign, they're not going to attack anyone, that's fine, but that doesn't address the issue of capability. And if you look at the capability of the democratic, so-called democratic Republican free market bloc of NATO, you see the largest military alliance in world history, right, coming to Russia's borders. So that's one issue. The other issue is that I forgot my second point. The other issue is the problem of regime change and authoritarianization that can occur over time in Europe. There's nothing written in some holy book somewhere that says the West is going to remain entirely democratic for history, and therefore it's benign. Of course, we know that even as a democratic, even in its democratic state, it's not always benign. But put that large question aside, which is very important in itself, and just look at the possibility that, if you use the democratic peace theory, that two democratic regimes are less likely to go to war, right? If you buy that argument, then of course the full argument is that they don't go to war with each other. The argument that they don't go to war with authoritarian regimes is less clear. But if you want to make that argument, you look at that, it doesn't hold water, because even if you look inside NATO, we already see Turkey, for example, is a borderline. Even if you look at the standard rankings of democratic countries, Turkey is, not a high ranker there. One can argue it's a soft authoritarian regime and not really a full-fledged democracy, or an illiberal democracy. Maybe we could lose that terminology. If you look at people, for example, liberals in the West accuse Hungary of moving in an authoritarian direction. For a while, they were accusing, until things happened with Ukraine. Now they need Poland, but they were making the same argument about Poland. Now everybody's going to forget about that. But They were making the same argument about Poland. So it's quite clear that, yes, democratic countries that are NATO members can move in a more authoritarian direction. And if they can move in a new authoritarian direction, then according to the theory, they're likely to be more aggressive. So that's that argument. And then your second point was, again, I forgot the second issue.
Ukraine is a sovereign country. It gets to choose if it wants to be involved in NATO.
That's the open door. The open door argument, right? We open the doors stay open. We didn't even open the doors. Sometimes the argument's made almost as if that's the case. Here's NATO, the doors are open. Well, what can we do? The doors are open. Doors are open. People are going to walk through, right? Well, what can we do? Oh yeah, you can close the doors. It's very simple, right? Or you can close the doors temporarily, right? And say, well, we'll invite more members in when Russia democratizes, and maybe we can bring Russia in, so we won't have a problem with Russia, right? Could have done that in the early 90s. Brought Russia in first, kept that secret that was our goal, but tried to arrange things such that Russia came in any first wave of expansion. And it took 10 years to negotiate that. Fine, who cares? At that time, there was no problem. There was no security issue with Russia. So that's one thing. The doors, are kept open, and by the West. The West can close the doors. The other issue is that that decision is not made based on the NATO charter. Whether Ukraine's going to be Ukraine in the present context of the world today, in Eurasia and Europe today, whether Ukraine becomes a member of NATO is not something that's going to be decided by the NATO charter. And it's not going to be decided by whether Russia has a right, some God-given right, or the West has some God-given right to expand NATO, or Russia has a God-given right to not allow Ukraine to join NATO, or doesn't have a right to a sphere of influence, like they like to say in NATO. For example, Russia has no right to a sphere of influence. None of this is international relations, okay? International relations and international law, they're not very sticky things, right? Great powers do what the heck they want quite often. We saw that in Kosovo. We saw that in Serbia when we bombed Belgrade without a NATO mandate. In Libya when we violated the UN resolution that we wouldn't get involved when we set up the no-fly zone. Happens all the time. But when we recognize Kosovo and so forth and so on. Great powers have the ability to establish rights, and they usually do that either through negotiations or by force. And there are no rights. When it comes to competition between great powers, there are no rights. There are rights to the extent that great powers recognize that there are rights and agree to them, right? So there were a set of rules post Yalta, about the post World War II world. The problem is there were no rules ever established about the post-Cold War world, right? And we began to establish a rule when we said we would not expand NATO 1 inch past Germany, and then we violated it. Mm-hmm. And ever since then, it's been great powers, the superpower of the United States and its allied powers, expanding NATO because there's nothing Russia could do about it. Now, Russia decided there's something they can do about it, at least in Ukraine. So this is how things are resolved. If people don't want to come to agree, it's. I know I sound like I'm giving a baby talk, but unfortunately, there are people in Washington and D.C. who just don't seem to understand these fundamental things. Right? It's not a matter of Russia having a right. Russia will prove that it has a right or not. It will establish in Ukraine by some sort of victory or defeat in this war whether or not it has the capability, it's not a matter of right, of establishing a sphere of influence over Ukraine. And that's what it's come down to. And we created that situation in which all rules were basically no holds barred, and pushed Russia into a corner of sorts, created an illegitimate regime in Kiev, and so forth. So this is the situation we've come to.
Yeah, it's the our rules-based international order, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
how are we doing for time, Gordon? Do you have to get going, or do you have a bit more time?
I probably got 10 more minutes.
Okay. Maybe then, maybe as a way of kind of getting back to your book and summarizing it a bit. Well, well, so currently, as you mentioned at the beginning of the show, we're kind of on the cusp of that first phase. That's the end of a cycle. It's the kind of re-traditionalizing of Russia. And I wanted to just bring up a couple things, maybe ask you to give your thoughts on those too. And that I kind of hinted at this with the Navalny thing, is that people don't, Westerners don't understand Russian history. They don't understand Russian strategic culture or political culture. And to the extent that they understand, Russian culture, it doesn't really, it's not sufficient for understanding what's going on or for understanding Russians, I think. But people actually don't understand Russian people. And by Russian people, I mean just, I'll use a stereotype, like the Russian stereotype. So of course, not all Russians are like that, right? But there is, but nations do have trends. So I was looking at, there's an article that came out recently that Jonathan Haidt co-wrote, and he's a psychologist, and he's famous for his moral foundations. I don't think he helped refine it and develop it. Basically, the moral foundations that people have, and so you can compare within groups. So you can compare, Democrats and Republicans in the states. But now they've done a huge study expanding that to different cultures around the world. And so when looking at it, there's basically, according to how they look at it, there's basically like 6 moral foundations, and some of them are, for instance, like compassion, authority, loyalty, purity, and these are the kinds of things that people either value or don't value, and they seems kind of to be like the main psychological foundations of the moralities that different cultures have. Now, Russians. Can you guess what Russians are? The top 2, the strongest among Russians, are loyalty and authority. So these will kind of trump. It'll trump compassion, though that's not to say that Russians aren't compassionate or can't be compassionate. It'll trump even purity to some degree, but purity is often tied with those among, let's say, Republicans or conservatives in the States, for instance. So when people are looking at Russia, or looking at Russians, I think there's a lot of projection going on that, the Russian people must really want what we want, which is, to be a liberal democracy. Well, it's like, maybe under certain conditions, but let's look at what they actually want now. After the war, all indications are that like 70+% of the population supports Putin and supports the war going on. And once Russia commits to a path like that, it's like, again, look at that history. What did Russia do when they committed to World War II? Well, they didn't just, slink off into the corner. They lost 27 million people or whatever winning the war. And it's like, I've been to Russia once. I visited a few years ago. And what's the one thing you notice wherever you go in Russia? Tanks. Tanks and like monuments and stuff. So you turn a corner and there's like a tank and kids are playing on it. It's like a statue of a tank, or maybe like a monument, and kids are playing on it. I went to this one market and they've got like these kind of artillery mortar firing things, and they're all painted with the flowers, and they're part of like a permanent installation. You walk around and that's what Russia's like, and that's what Russians are like. So I just wanted to ask your opinion on that and see if you had any comments or like, things that you might tell people to say, well, this is kind of what Russia's actually like, or maybe you want to kind of like contradict me or tell me I'm missing something there.
No, I think that there's a lot in there to unwrap. You might say, if you take Billington's book on the history of Russian culture, The Icon, the Axe, if you want to take the title of my book and change it into symbols on that model, it might be, the tank and the traitor, right? Those are the 2 icons. Those are the 2 icons of the Russia's security vigilance culture, right? Or the vigilance norm, right? Is right. The tank is for self-defense against those crazy Westerners who knows are going to throw up another Hitler someday or another smuta or something. And the traitor is those people inside our country who don't understand that, right? And that's a real part of Russia's political culture. That doesn't need to be overstated, right? It doesn't mean that there's intense anti-Westernism. That's not true. And again, as I said earlier, there's recessive periods when pro-Westernism comes to the fore. And so on the other, the poll you mentioned, that's actually more interesting, and it serves as almost as an introduction, as a segue from this book that we're talking about, Russia's Dilemma, to my next book, which is going to be published, called Celostnost, which is wholeness in Russian culture, thought, culture, history, and politics. And basically that came out of the end of this book, right? The idea was that, so if dissent and disunity inside the country is a danger because it can be used by outside Western forces to weaken us and prepare for an invasion, or get us to abandon our culture and to move in more opposite directions and from our tradition, and create more pluralism, which creates more dissent, and so forth and so on. And then at some point, the West can use that. The opposite of that is, right, a desire or an aspiration for unity, right? So if you look at those two, what was it? The two characteristics, chief, were authority and loyalty, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, loyalty and authority. Well, what guarantees unity? It's everyone being loyal to the authority, right? Otherwise, you have dissent and disunion, and problems. And so basically my new book is Celostness. The idea is that there are basically four different types of celostness. The last one is the political kind, which we just talked about. But that's sort of a symptom or a end result of the first three. And the first three are celostness, what I'm calling monism. And that is, it comes basically from religion, though it morphed during the Soviet period into other things, man and machine. But in its origins in Russian religious culture is the idea that God and man are united, heaven and earth are united, spirit and matter are united. And this, because of the deep religious nature of the Russian people up until 1917, this became, an assumption, a value, and an aspiration, right? The idea that at the end of the world, in the second coming, Christ comes down and heaven and earth are united, right? And spirit and matter dissolve into one, into God, and so forth, into the single being, right? So that's the first form, monism. And then the next is universalism, right? The idea that the whole world should be united, right? And I don't want to go into all the details because we're limited on time, but essentially, the most simple version, right, is the Soviet period, right, when the idea of the socialism, united socialist world, the proletarians of the world unite, right? We would create a united world government, and all the world would be united. The same thing that is preceded in Orthodox, in the idea of Orthodox religion, in which everyone, according to the Christian faith, not just the Orthodox, but the Christian faith, right, is everyone will become Christian. Those who are not will be condemned to hell. Once everyone becomes a believer and a Christian, of course, there's the idea of the problem of the apocalypse. But once, at some point, the people who remain will all be believers, and then you have the apocalypse and then the second coming, right? So that's another idea of universal. And there are many, many others. Dostoevsky writes about it. Dostoevsky writes about how Pushkin, his main character, and it's the main character of the Russian people, is their receptivity to other cultures, right? So their ability to relate to other cultures and their desire to, understand European literature, understand Eastern religions, their attractiveness, and then their ability, in Pushkin's case, to actually, in his literature, portray these things in a way that's almost as if he's from India or he's from France or whatever, right? And then Dostoevsky argues, this is the chief Dostoevsky, right, who's obviously a very influential figure in Russian culture, argues that this is the essential character of the Russian people, right? So this is another form of universalism. There are many others. And I go through the whole history of Russian culture and history and thought and show all the different examples. The third kind is collectivism, which are obvious, right? The communalism of the pre-Soviet period, right, of the Russian village and the so-called Russian obshchina, or agrarian community, in which you had, a set of 10 or 15 families that joined together, no private property, but they worked the land together and they exchanged plots and so forth and so on, and then shared the produce and so forth and so on. And then the Soviet collectivism period, we don't need to talk about that. It's obvious, right? The Soviet collectivism is a continuation of that. So that's the third, communalism, collectivism. And then the final is this political unity, which I call solidarnost, right? Or solidarity in Russian, solidarnost. And that basically is the idea that we should aspire, or there is actually some kind of national, political, cultural, linguistic, whatever unity. And if it doesn't exist, then we need to make it exist. And this, of course, creates, I'm not saying an insurmountable barrier, but a certain barrier to pluralism, right? Because if everybody is supposed to be united, well, then there shouldn't be a lot of squabbling parties. There shouldn't be a lot of competing businesses, different a class structure where people have different levels of interest and conflicting interests, right, and so forth. This is not conducive to unity. And again, I want to make a caveat. I don't see this as an insurmountable barrier, but it does lead to a certain tendency to, under certain circumstances, reject pluralism and reject the free market, and so on. And then again, this is also something that undergoes all these different values, especially the collectivism and solidarism, also undergo this recessive dominant shifting depending on the situation, right? It's part of this change in Russian culture and politics and thinking that changes over time depending on events inside the country and events that occur in the West. And so that's the new book that I just signed a contract for and should be published in about 4 months. And I don't know if they're going to let me keep the title Selflessness, but
yeah,
that's the title right now, which basically means wholeness in Russian, or integrality, which I recently found out actually isn't an English word. You don't have a word called integrality. So, and integrity doesn't really work.
Yeah.
Well, I just have two quick closing comments. One is that sounds like a very interesting book. And it reminds me a little bit of the themes that were examined by Gary Lachman in The Return of Holy Russia. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that book. I have not read that, but I
probably should read it, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I mean, just how deeply you're going into some of these themes is quite interesting. And just the other thing I'll say, my last word, your caveats are superb. Great caveats.
Thank you.
The whole show. I enjoyed them.
Yeah, that was great, Gordon.
If you want a draft of the book, I'll send you a copy by email. Any comments appreciated.
Yeah, I'd love it. And
it's not published yet, but I can send you. I can send you the draft in PDF form or whatever.
Yep. No, we'd love to check it out, and then maybe, well, of course, when it's published, then we can have you on again to talk about it, because that sounds right up our alley. I know you got to go.
They're saying it should be published. Yeah, they're saying it will be published in 4 months. So
that's excellent. Okay, well, great. Thank you, Gordon. We'll give a link to where you can buy the book in the show description. Okay. The website is gordonhahn.com, HAHN, or is it gordonmhahn.com?
No, Gordon Hahn.
gordonhahn.com. So you can check out your regular writings on current events and things of that sort. So thank you, Gordon. We had a great time. Enjoy the book, and looking forward to talking to you again.
Always great to talk to you guys. It's always a fun interview. Thank you very much.
Great.
We appreciate
you.
Take
care. Stay safe.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Bye-bye.